Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Once again, as we welcome you to Wednesday nights with myself, Inayet Wadee. Now, for the next half an hour, we are going to be focusing on Afghanistan. And we are talking about victims who are not entitled to seize the Afghan Central Bank assets. And we've heard the announcement that had come through from Joe Biden, and also looking at Afghanistan, where it is at this point in time, a country that has obviously been ravaged by war, and one knows about the economic situation, the socio-economic situation, and just looking at those who have been suffering as a result of what has been taking place in Afghanistan. And we know that, the looking at the banks as well, and we're talking of close on to $10 billion worth of assets that they don't have any access to. And this evening, we are joined out of Chicago from the United States of America. We're joined by Hadiya Afzal, who is with a group called Unfreeze Afghanistan. Hadiya, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome.
Walaikum salam. Thank you for having me on today.
Yes, wonderful you're able to join us. And let's just, before we actually get to what we'd like to talk about, I think the key issue here is everybody wants to see the Afghan nation living in peace and in prosperity. And this is a country that has suffered so much in more ways than one. And we're not talking of just suffering of, a matter of a few years. It's actually been going on for a very, very long time. We are talking about decades. And it's sad to see the country in the state that it is in at this point in time. And interestingly, I was just looking at Unfreeze Afghanistan, talking about a women-led campaign supporting the Afghan people for the very reasons we're talking about, so that they could just live in peace and prosperity.
Mhm. Exactly, yes. We think that it is very important to make sure the Afghan people are the center of this conversation always. And many times, women and children are the ones left behind. So it's important to keep everyone in mind as we move forward and try to come up with a solution for this crisis, which has been described as a humanitarian crisis and definitely is. We've seen widespread poverty, inflation, surging prices across the country, but it's also at its very heart an economic crisis. And we see this with the seizure of central bank assets, for example, by the United States, which I'm sure we'll talk about more.
Yes, and just for us to appreciate what is the situation on the ground, how would you describe it, Hadiya, in terms of what the Afghan people are going through as we speak?
So, our organization, Unfreeze Afghanistan, led a delegation of American women and peace activists to Kabul earlier this year. They spoke to students, teachers, local leaders, NGO folks over there on the ground. And what they saw was some startling widespread poverty, as I just mentioned. We're hearing reports every week that people are boiling grass to feed their families. They're being forced to sell off whatever they can to afford the food that is in the markets. But what we're seeing is a depression now in Afghanistan that is being exacerbated by a lack of access to their own central bank funds.
Yes, and also just looking at Afghanistan, and even after the United States government had decided to pull out of Afghanistan, we've seen just so much focus. And when one looks at the world media, when we look at mainstream media, there was a lot of focus on the politics of Afghanistan. There was a lot of focus on things like human rights, and will the Taliban government be ensuring the human rights of the people, but very little focus on the damage that had actually been done, and the dire situation on the ground. And this is where organizations like yourself, and I've seen it on your website as well, where you're saying that you are not a political group, you don't have political affiliation. Your key focus area is obviously you are committed to the Afghan population as a whole, but also if one looks at women and the suffering of women in Afghanistan, and we see this in most war like conditions. We see it in Syria, we see it in many other countries where women are actually left to carry this burden.
Mhm. Yeah, so there are multiple factors that have led to this current crisis at the moment. We're seeing, for For many months now, girls have not been allowed to attend higher education or high school education in public schools. But this has been applied differently across different parts of the country. In some provinces, we're seeing private schools still running. Other places have after-school programs that have adapted to try to provide lessons for girls as well. But all of this obviously doesn't measure up to the edicts that have been issued against women working in the workplace, traveling with a mehram, and other situations. But of course, this doesn't negate the underlying factor for a lot of these women. When our delegation was there, they spoke to a woman on the street who was begging for food, if she was wondering if her kids could go to school, her daughters could go to school. And she said that they can't even focus on sending their sons because they don't have money for a pencil and pieces of paper. Their focus is on survival. And I think that should be the focus of any allies who are looking to help those people, whether it's through increased humanitarian aid funding, or again, the release of their assets to prop up their economy, re-inject price stability and liquidity, and settle down the situation there.
Yes. Now let's just come to this whole issue surrounding the unfreezing of Afghan's assets, of Afghanistan's assets, and also the stranglehold in the absence of these funds being frozen. What is it actually doing to the country? And here we're talking about a country that was in a dire situation, and a country whose economy needs to recover.
Mm-hmm. So the Afghanistan Central Bank was built up, modeled after the U.S. Federal Reserve, actually, and it was staffed with civil servants who had been trained at the highest levels for every central bank mechanism and function necessary. So they had encouraged people to transfer over from the Hawala system into a more formalized banking system. The U.S. had encouraged Afghanistan, like many other sovereign nations, to place their assets overseas in the Federal Reserve in the U.S. to keep it safe. And after the Taliban took over last August, that money was immediately frozen. President Biden waited a while to issue a decision on what they were going to do with those assets. Early in February of this year, he issued an executive order saying that pending a lawsuit against the Taliban by the 9/11 victims' families, some of them, he was splitting the $7 billion in those assets in half. 3.5 pending the decision of that lawsuit, and the other 3.5 have been sitting waiting for some kind of plan. So we're seeing movement on both of those issues at the moment, and one of them was the recent lawsuit recommendation from a different federal judge.
Yes, in fact, this was quite interesting because obviously I was actually just following some of these developments, and the fact that this matter had actually gone to court, and we've seen what the judge had actually ruled in comparison to what Joe Biden had to say and what the American government wants, because it's in direct contrast with what the government is saying and what the court had actually said, Hadiya.
So what's interesting is that the Justice Department actually issued a memo shortly after that executive order that actually laid out many of the arguments echoed by the judge in this recommendation. She had 3 separate arguments that all individually stand on their own, but together make a very strong case that this lawsuit has no legal standing. So first, sovereign immunity protects the assets of any foreign nations that include Afghanistan. The U.S. hasn't done this to a lot of other nations that have their money in the United States. So the court itself lacks jurisdiction over Afghanistan Central Bank because it's a foreign government that has that immunity. Second, the U.S. hasn't recognized Taliban as the legitimate government of Afghanistan yet. So any ruling, the central bank's assets can be used to pay off the Taliban's judgment debts would amount to basically ruling the Taliban are the legitimate government. So the president has not done this yet, and the courts lack the constitutional authority to do it on their own. So this is an executive decision to make. And even if both those arguments didn't stand up, which we believe they do, the bank has to count as an agency of the Taliban, which means it has to willingly work with the group. But there's been no indication that there's been anything else than the Taliban seizing control of the bank and imposing their own leaders and appointing their own people in charge. So these are all very strong legal arguments that we hope will be sent up and accepted by the federal judge in charge of this case. But so far, that's what's been issued.
Yes, in fact, what you're saying is very interesting because I'm just while you were talking, my mind actually raced back to what had taken place in Iran at the time of the Shah of Iran, and he had all his assets in the United States of America and some of the other Western banks, and all of that were actually frozen after Khomeini had actually come into power, and none of that money had actually come back into the Iranian economy. So we're looking at a similar scenario that is now developing in Afghanistan.
Yes, and we're actually seeing some new developments. I think soon there have been discussions of returning to Iran nuclear agreement that could see some of the central bank assets of Iran unfrozen, which would provide a key for this case as well, an example for it. But we are seeing a very sharp increase in the level of devastation from this Afghanistan freeze because of just the overwhelming amount of it and the impact it's had on the economy.
Yes.
Along
Now,
with the humanitarian aid aspect of their economy that disappeared almost overnight when the U.S. pulled out.
yes. Now, obviously, when one looks at what had taken place in on 9/11, and it does appear as if the blame game and all the blame is actually placed on Afghanistan. And this seems to be the primary reason. This seems to be the motivating factor. And you mentioned that Afghanistan, this hasn't been done to other countries, but why Afghanistan has actually been singled out, Hadiya. And do you think this could be the reason that the events of 9/11, where Afghanistan has now faced with taking total responsibility for what had taken place on September the 11th?
So we work with an organization called 9/11 Families for Peaceful Tomorrow. And a lot of those individuals have been very outspoken about how this money does not belong to anyone but the Afghan people. They've issued many press releases. We filed an amicus brief with the court supporting their argument as well. And as they've said before, a lot of those families didn't join this lawsuit to take money from the Afghan people. A lot of them joined to see whether Saudi Arabia could be held to account for their role in 9/11, for example. So this has spiraled into sort of a situation that is that doesn't really speak for all 9/11 victims' families. And there have been, again, very outspoken talking about who this money rightfully belongs to and the need for this money to be sent back to Afghanistan to shore up their economy and help their people.
Yes, and you make an interesting point with regard to Saudi Arabia, for instance, not being held accountable, because I suppose in comparison to Saudi Arabia, there's a lot more for the United States to gain from Saudi Arabia rather than Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen reporting recently that talks are actually back on between the Taliban and the State Department, which is heartening because diplomacy is the only way to really get through these kinds of crises. There are arguments that the U.S. shouldn't be talking to the Taliban, they shouldn't be dealing with this organization, but the U.S. deals with repressive governments all over the world, and the point of that talk and discussion is to find the best solution for the people living in that country, not necessarily to cater to the rulers that you're talking to.
Yes, and just looking at the Taliban government and the capacity within the government, and say this money comes back to Afghanistan, and in terms of dealing with the situation in terms of governance, how well equipped is the Taliban government at this point in time?
So we have, there have been a lot of organizations and multiple NGOs. There was a huge economist letter recently led by Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz urging for the return of this money. We've also been working, Dr. Shah Marabi is the chair of the Central Bank's Audit Committee, and he oversees the technical aspects of that monitoring. And he has attested that there is independent monitoring and electronic auditing of the bank's transactions. So any of that would be in place through independent monitoring if that return were to happen. There is capacity available still. and any that's been lost can be built back up. And that should be a priority if returning the money and seeing it dispersed, or like not even dispersed, but just used properly, is a priority for them. So
Yes,
it can
and
happen.
but even Hadiya, when we're talking about the amount of money that is being frozen, and I'm sure that is still not enough, considering the damage that has been done and the damage control that needs to be done to get Afghanistan back onto its feet.
Sure, exactly. I mean, the 3.5 billion attached to that lawsuit could take months to ever be free. The other 3.5 billion, though, are able to be sent out very soon as long as the proper credentialing is given to the central bank. We just did a recent briefing, an anniversary webinar with experts from Human Rights Watch and other organizations that have all come out and supported this kind of return.
Yes, well, that's also encouraging to note that you have got support coming through from the likes of Human Rights Watch and other organizations. But again, coming to the point that this is going to be a long battle. It's going to be a hard battle. It's going to be a very, very difficult battle, and the reality on the ground is only getting worse by the day, Hadiya.
Exactly. We've seen leaders of aid organizations that have been working in Afghanistan for years be very open and public about calling for a difference in the approach to Afghanistan. There was a huge section of the economy that was built on the donor community, the international donor community, that again almost vanished and has been difficult to bring back. Funding for development projects has withered away in Afghanistan. Global aid funding and pledges have also fallen short. And as many advocates have repeated over and over again, aid is good, but aid is not enough for a country to run its economy on. And so while pushing for increased funding through the UN and other pledges is great, that is a stopgap solution that is growing weaker by the month. And with another winter approaching, the only reason that we didn't see the numbers of famine and devastation that we were expecting last winter is because of that emergency flash funding. But again, that's not sustainable. And with the war in Ukraine, other global problems right now, a lot of concerns are that Afghanistan will slip out of the spotlight when it comes to funding, when it really needs that help the most.
Well, certainly, and also I think interesting when you speak about Ukraine and Russia, but right next door to Afghanistan, we've got this crisis that has developed in Pakistan as well, and I'm sure that has had an impact.
Yeah, I mean, the war in Ukraine has had an enormous impact on basic goods and prices in the region, radiating to Afghanistan. We've seen the enormous earthquake earlier this year that was absolutely devastating. The aid response was difficult because of the harsh sanctions placed on the country. We're seeing the flooding right now as well. The agricultural community has been devastated by this in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so, people in those places will tell you they know aid is good, but again, it's not enough to fix the structural problems that are leading to the scale of the devastation that we're seeing. It requires
Yes,
structural changes.
well, exactly. And also, I think, when one looks at the situation in Afghanistan, and I suppose in many countries, is you look upon your neighbors first to provide you with the type of assistance. And that is the reason why I spoke about Pakistan and neighboring Pakistan, because Pakistan is now right in a middle of an economic crisis. It's in the middle of a political crisis. And obviously, with the devastation that has been caused by the flooding, has made the situation even worse. So, as far as Afghanistan is concerned, I'm not too sure whether much can be expected from Pakistan in any form of assistance whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, my family's from Pakistan. I've been keeping in touch with them about, the flooding and just what they've been going through in that country. It's been very tough, but, obviously there's a very close link between the two countries. People feel for the people of Afghanistan and we are rooting for them every day. And I believe our work will hopefully help to lift up the people of the region, not just one country.
Yes. Now, just looking at your Unfreeze Afghanistan, what other options have you got? Besides obviously lobbying, and creating awareness?
So we've been working with a coalition of organizations around the world. We have some people based in Kabul. We have some working at levels of the U.S. government. We have others that are working in public awareness, hosting public seminars, webinars, briefings. We're trying to talk to the people in charge who can bring this solution about. And there are a bunch of different actors all involved, and we're trying to make sure that we communicate the needs of the Afghan people to them and to convey the urgency that this situation requires, because that money has been sitting there for over a year now, and we know what is to come if nothing is hurried. And so we're just really pushing that urgency right now, wherever we
Well,
can.
Hadiya, I must say it's been an absolute pleasure having you on with us and talking to us this evening here on Assalam Media. We wish you all the best, and I'm sure at some point in time we will have further engagements, looking specifically at Afghanistan. But for now, we thank you for your time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Hadiya Afzal, Unfreeze Afghanistan, with us this evening. The time is just gone, 25 minutes past 8. We come back, we still have got much more to talk about, and we are going to be talking about this much talked about scourge of housejackings that are taking place in the country, and this is of a major concern. We're talking about organized syndicates that are invading residential properties. They are taking over, and to get them out is a problem. So we will be talking with two attorneys this evening, just to understand some of the legal issues and also some of the background, and to understand what can actually be done to remedy the situation. So when we come back, we'll be joined by Fiona Warwood and Isa Ahmed.